helping accommodate my visit, and to the CEA staff who always help me be well prepared. Earlier today, as you just heard, the President talked about the progress we've made in helping to build a more prosperous and equitable economy on behalf of the American people. He described that progress in terms of sustained low unemployment, job and real wage gains, solid real GDP growth driven by strong consumer spending and investment. He talked about the optimism embedded in the record 19 million people who have filed to start small businesses, the unsnarling of supply chains, the record energy production, the investment in key sectors of domestic production like clean energy and chips to ensure America's position in the global economy. And he marked this moment in our economic progress by citing the actions taken by the Federal Reserve yesterday to lower the benchmark interest rate they control, an action that will help lower the borrowing cost for homes, cars, credit cards, and borrowing to start or build a business. The Fed's action also underscores the historically unusual fact that all of the progress I just described occurred during a period of significant and critically important disinflation. Though these words, thankfully, did not appear in the President's remarks today, in CEA language, he was talking about the very low sacrifice ratio that has characterized this economic expansion. This ratio derives from the historically negative relationship between unemployment and inflation. It describes how many percentage points of unemployment, for example, we would have to accept to get inflation back down to its target. That concept is why, not that long ago, we saw prominent headlines and commentary assuring us that it would take much slower growth. One headline proclaimed a 100 chance of recession last year to achieve the disinflation that has occurred. And yet here we are with 6.5 percentage points of CPI disinflation and the solid economic conditions I described above. Quoting Chair Powell from yesterday, quote, "I don't see anything in the economy now that suggests the likelihood of a downturn is elevated. The U.S. economy is in a good place. More specifically, the economy is growing at a solid pace with inflation coming down closer to our 2% objective over time, and the labor market is in solid shape." Now, we underscore these dynamics in CEA's most recent blog post, if I can get figure one. Thank you. This is a blog post that you can get from the CEA website. What this shows is, in fact, inflation over the period where it went up and disinflated against a set of forecasts that were made by the blue chip forecasters, by CBO, by the Fed's FOMC SEP committee. And you see that the inflation forecasts were quite good, quite accurate. They pretty much follow the dark line, which is the actual line. Next slide. That gets very different when you look at the unemployment rate. In fact, the title of our blog is How the Economy Defied the Forecasts. Here we have the forecast predicting unemployment would have been very high in order to achieve that much disinflation. And in fact, what we have here in this shaded area is the most optimistic and the most pessimistic estimations of where the unemployment rate would be by the blue chip forecasters. These are the most optimistic because they're the lowest. We beat the most optimistic forecast when it came to unemployment. If, next slide please, if in fact the forecasts were correct, this is how much more unemployment we would have had, how much more unemployment households and American workers would have been stuck with if we hadn't beaten even the most optimistic forecast on unemployment. And you can see those numbers range from 1 to north of 5 million unemployed persons whose fate was avoided by the trends I've showed you thus far. And finally, figure 4 shows the same dynamic for GDP. Again, beating the most optimistic forecast of the blue chip, which in this case would be the upper part of the shaded area. I'll close with another important reference to the President's speech today. The part about, and you heard this from Kareem, our work is not done. As he put it, I am not here to take a victory lap. I'm not here to say the job is done. I'm not here to say we don't have more work to do. Of course we do. Our cost-cutting agenda in particular is as urgent today as it was before the Fed acted, but that fact should not prevent anyone from recognizing the progress we've made, the expectation-defying ongoing expansion, and the work, productivity, and grit of the American people to get us where we are today. And with that, I'll take your questions.
All right. Thank you. You're, one of the people that the president would call if he has any questions about the American economy. I was curious to ask you, what would you say is an economic issue that the president these days is asking the most sort of probing questions to you about, whether it's a data point or a phenomenon or something that he's seeing in the economy?
Well, I've been talking to the president a lot in the last few days, as have met many other members of the team in preparation for the speech he gave today. So I am ready with a very timely answer to that question. It's the same. It's a similar dynamic, similar conversation I've had with Joe Biden since I was his chief economist when he was the vice president. He wants to know how these economic developments, how the progress I've talked about today that he spoke about affects working families like the one he grew up in. And right now, that relates a lot to the interest rate cut. How does a cut in interest rate ripple through to the economic lives of working American families? And the answer that I shared with him, and I'll share with you, is lower costs of lending, lower costs of a mortgage, lower costs if you want to take out a loan to improve your home, lower costs of auto loans, credit cards if you want to start or expand a small business. Lower interest rates are really meaningful to people. It's one of the it's really one of the key economic variables in a lot of people's lives through that channel of borrowing costs, and that's certainly, I think, a timely example of things we've discussed lately.
And how did you prepare him for the possibility of the Fed making the kind of cut that it did yesterday?
Having conversations much like the one we discussed. I mean, we're very careful, as you know, to respect the independence of the Fed, but of course we're always going to talk about any important dynamic or variable in the economy, and so this is a conversation we've had, and it goes right to the impact of it goes right to the impact on the economic lives of the families we discussed. I think also part of this discussion has been about the trajectory of inflation. And here, I want to underscore something I said in my topper, but also the president leaned in today. Very important to him. We've had a lot of discussions about this. So direct answer to your question. He's been very interested in these predictions that said, sorry, you can't get this much disinflation, 6.5 points on the CPI, without accepting a much worse unemployment rate or much slower GDP growth. That is the more kind of traditional within those shaded areas in the figures I showed. And the president felt strongly that we were not going to achieve disinflation on the backs of working people. We needed to get there through improvements in the economy supply side, through energy production, through cost reductions in the areas where we've tried to do more of that. So maintaining the strong economy on behalf of working families while getting to lower inflation has been essential for rising real wages and incomes, and that's what we've seen.
Hey, Chair. Thanks for being here. One of the issues that has still proven to be very difficult is getting housing prices down. Can you walk us through, do you have any kind of numbers to put on housing prices and the importance that they play within the CPI bundle in terms of, now that we've had the interest rate cut, how much more is it, our housing prices going to come down? And then I asked this question yesterday, but I want to ask you again. I mean, with the escalating tensions in the Middle East and the possibility of a broader regional war growing, how do you assess the impact on prices, both in terms of oil and other factors?
Okay, so on housing prices, you're very much correct that the CPI, as well, the CPI in particular, but the index I was showing earlier, which is the PCE different index, they have heavy weights for housing, CPI in particular. In the CPI, the housing weight is, I think, around 35%. It's shelter is the single largest weight, I believe, in the CPI. And so it's very impactful. And one of the ways we showed that in a recent blog that we did, which I think, I commend to you because we really dive into your question on the CEA website, is we pointed out that if you look at core inflation over the past year in the CPI, that's inflation without energy and food, 3.2%. Core inflation CPI without shelter, half of that, 1.6%. So it really gives you a flavor of how heavy that weight is. Now, there are two things going on with housing prices in the CPI. One is cyclical or mechanical, and the other is, or maybe call it, something, well, one is cyclical or mechanical, and the other is structural. So the mechanical part is that as rental inflation has rolled over, and it really has, I mean, the inflation of rents was highly elevated. It's now back to levels that we saw pre-pandemic, and this is rental inflation now, not the price